So my name is Bryan Kam. I've been an Interintellect host for about 5 years. It's pretty close to the start. I think March 2020, I first joined a salon and quickly started hosting. And my background is actually in English literature. And then I went and worked in tech for a long time. And since then, I've gotten really interested both in Western and Eastern philosophy. I'm working on a book called Neither Nor, which is about the relationship between experience and conceptual thinking throughout a bunch of different periods of Eastern and Western philosophy, which overlaps a lot with the content of this book, which is why I'm really excited about what sort of is a conceptual system versus what is embodied, practical, ethical engagement. How do we cope with uncertainty using concepts, or how do we face uncertainty in embodied experience? So I think that's all I'll say about my work. I will link to some of my writing in the chat. And I think I'll just hand it over to Stephen to say a little bit about yourself and just however much about you want about this book before I begin asking you questions.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank both Brian as the host, obviously, but also Intellect, which has is hosting in a wider sense this conversation that we're going to have. I don't want to go into a great deal of background information about myself. Uh, I guess if I boil it down to sort of bare bones, um, I grew up in London. And I failed my A levels, and that gave me a year off to go and wander through the world. And I ended up in India. This is in 1972. I'm 19 years old. And that moment of landing in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama has lived for now many years, that really launched my whole Buddhist career, if you want to put it in those terms. And since then, since 1972, Buddhism is all that I've ever done. I don't have a real job in the real world. I live by my wits. I was a monk for 10 years, and I've been married now for about 40 years. And throughout that entire time, I've made my living through teaching Buddhist retreats, writing books on the topic, and doing all sorts of other related activities that come with that sort of territory. But I think when I look back on all that now, I see the primary drive in my adult life has been that of a writer. And Buddhism, in a way, is what gave me the materials to start developing a philosophical interest in the greater questions of life, as it were. Um, but also, it awoke in me my own passion for creativity and expression, and trying to find words to match what I actually experienced. And Buddhist materials were at the beginning of when I first started Buddhism, very little was available in English. We had to learn all this stuff in my case, Tibetan, which is the language in which I did my monastic training primarily. And through that struggle with very different languages, very different ways of thinking, I also was acutely aware of the fact that I wasn't a Tibetan or a Japanese, but I was I was a British kid who grew up in Watford and was trying to make sense of his life. And I found enormous resonances and inspiration in my encounters with Tibetan Buddhists initially, but then I subsequently went on and spent 4 years in a Zen monastery in South Korea. And throughout that whole 50-year period, I have always been working on a book. Initially translations from Tibetan, but I've now, this book, Buddha, Socrates, and Us, is actually my 12th book under my own name. And I look back now, I'm now 72, and I increasingly think of all of these books as basically being chapters in a bigger book. In other words, I see a body of work now rather than lots of individual attempts to address a particular topic or theme. And what I've also discovered, and I think this is very much in a way triggered by my practice of mindfulness and awareness and attention and so on, and also just the experience of learning how to still and quieten the mind and come to rest in a kind of non-reactive space of attention. That's also very much been the framework within which my ideas have developed, in which I've struggled with certain Buddhist concepts like reincarnation, for example, and in which I've tried to find a discourse, find a language that speaks to our condition today. A lot of these ideas, whether it's from Greek philosophy or whether it's from Buddhism, are speaking to people who lived in a world in many ways very different to our own in the fifth century BC. And that can sometimes make it seem as though these things are very ancient, very, very distant in a way. But what I've always found remarkable, both when I read Buddhist texts or whether I read Plato, is that how much of this material speaks very directly to the condition of being human now. In other words, although we think that 2,500 years ago was a hell of a long time, in fact, it wasn't that long ago, really. In fact, if you do a little thought experiment, if you imagine that after the Buddha's death in about 400 BC, he died at the age of 80. If you imagine him dying then, and then a child is born at the same time, and then 80 years later that child dies, and then another child is born at that time, and another 80 years later that new child dies. How many people would have lived in that way since the Buddha or Socrates' time? Turns out only 30. We would think intuitively it'd be more than that, hundreds of people maybe. But no, just 30 human lifetimes separate us sitting here in this Zoom room today from the Buddha and Gautama and Socrates and all of these characters who lived so long ago. So it's both distant in one way, absolutely it is, but it's also, I think, very close at the same time. And the closeness, I think, is because what the Buddha was addressing and what Socrates was addressing were basically the same fundamental questions that we all have now. In other words, what does it mean to be a human being? What is the value of leading a good life? How should we live on earth? What happens after death? What's the meaning of death? All of these questions are fundamental existential questions that we're asking today with the same bafflement and the same intensity and the same fear, perhaps, as were the Buddha and Socrates and those people living all that long time ago. What perhaps was the main trigger for this particular book was the COVID lockdown. I'd been interested for many years, probably going back 10 or 15 years ago now, to Hellenistic philosophy, which struck me as initially as being the schools of philosophy in our culture, the Western culture, that seem to be most compatible with ideas that we know from Buddhism. And I'm not the only person to think of this. Stoicism, particularly, which is a Hellenistic philosophy, Epicureanism, and skepticism too, all emerged around in the century after the death of Socrates. And they too developed and picked up on ideas that you find in Plato and elsewhere, but they in particular sought to establish philosophy as very much a way of life. And there's a famous book by a man called Pierre Hadot called Philosophy as a Way of Life. And it's this philosophy as a way of life, I think, that probably resonates most directly with my experience of Buddhist philosophy. It's not just something you study in a book or in a university course and you exercise your intellect and you get some insight into what these people may have thought and how things might be in the world. But in both Buddhism and in Stoicism, and I would say going back to Socrates as well, is that such a kind of philosophy is not just going on between our ears in our brains, but philosophy is a way to engage the totality of our humanity with the conditions of the world and the issues of the world that confront us in our lives from moment to moment. And I think one of the big attractions to Buddhism recently, well, it's in the last 50 years or so, is precisely because it offers us strategies, ways in which we can actually work with our mental states and our emotions and our feelings, but in a way that is integrated into an ethical and a philosophical view of the world. And to me, that remains very, very central. So when COVID happened, I suddenly found myself with an unspecified length of time ahead of me where I couldn't go anywhere. I was stuck in my office here in France. And I was liberated basically from my life of endlessly getting on a plane and going off to some center in Switzerland or America, wherever, to lead a retreat, and then, coming home and going off again. I was very, very busy in that world for many years. And then suddenly it all stopped, as I'm sure each of us can recognize in our own specific ways. And that was like a huge breathing space opened up. And I can't remember exactly why, but it struck me that this would be an opportunity now to go into the parts of Greek philosophy I hadn't explored, and that was primarily Plato. The Platonic dialogues, which I'm sure, as you're all aware, are very much centered around this rather enigmatic figure called Socrates. But once I had opened up that, started going down that rabbit hole, inevitably all kinds of other things came up as well, simply to get a handle on what ancient Athens was like. It wasn't just a bunch of philosophers, it was a complex society, a democracy, one of the first democracies. And it was also a society at war. And Socrates was a foot soldier in the Athenian army. And it was a society that generated a huge body of artistic work, particularly drama. The great tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes. All of these were written in exactly the same period as Socrates lived, which also turns out to be exactly the same period in which the Buddha lived. Now, that's something that a lot of people don't realize, that Socrates and the Buddha were contemporaries. And we only really know that now because of recent scholarly work done in the field of Buddhism that has put a lot of effort into trying to get the best, the most accurate dates we can hope for in terms of the Buddha's life. And it's now estimated the Buddha lived from about 480 to about 400 BC. And Socrates is acknowledged as living from about 470 to 399 BC. So 399 is the only actual date we have for that we can historically verify. But the point is, even though these two men obviously didn't have any contact with each other, there was a huge distance between them, they were nonetheless inhabiting the same planet, the same Earth as we live on today. They were people who I feel were also very much addressing the same kinds of questions. How do you live? Both Socrates and the Buddha, I think, put primary emphasis on the question of ethics. And by that, I don't mean morality, in other words, lists of precepts and rules, but rather ethics as, again, a way of life, a practice in which one seeks to form and shape one's character. The word ethics is based on the Greek ethos, which means character. So how do we shape ourselves, form ourselves into the kind of persons we aspire to be? What is our kind of model of how I would best perform in any given situation? And if we can answer those kinds of questions, then we're getting close to what I would understand as ethics. Obviously, Yeah, that's right. Somebody, the host, that's you. Traditional dating, yeah, he was born about 580 and he died about, no, I can't remember. I think he born about 560 and he died about 400. In any case, it's got 80 years closer to our time, as Brian points out. Anyway, I think I'm rambling a bit here, so I think it probably is a good idea if I pass over now to Brian and you can actually ask me some specific questions about this book.
Yeah, that was a wonderful introduction. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this. So, one of my questions is about these two figures, because I think you do a great job in the third chapter of pointing out some of the similarities between the Buddha and
Mhm.
Socrates. And one of my questions is about their differences, because I
Uh,
think especially in Plato's later dialogues, the interest is really becomes very conceptual in a way that I think you criticize a little bit, that the Platonic sort of forms, as well as the later aspects of Buddhism and the Abhidharma, become sort of overly conceptualized. But I suppose I'm curious. Yeah, one of my feelings and questions for you throughout the book was, doesn't Socrates ask questions that the Buddha would have refused to answer?
Um, uh, I don't know, to be honest. I don't think so, because I think what is strikingly similar about both of these men was that they effectively took a conscious decision to break from metaphysical theorizing. I mean, this is very clear with the case of the Buddha. I mean, he says, there's a famous parable of the arrow, which I talk about in the book, where people come to the Buddha and say, what is the mind and the body? Are they the same or different? Is the universe endless or does it have an end? These kinds of big questions. There's a list of them in Buddhist texts. And the Buddha basically says to each of these questions, we don't need to go there.
Mm,
In fact, actually says at one point, we could spend the rest, you could spend the rest of your life pursuing these questions, and you would still die before you got the answers. In other words, there are certain basic metaphysical questions that are going to lead us down all kinds of interesting pathways, but they may not actually address the more core questions that affect us as human persons. So, in the parable of the arrow, the Buddha describes a person who's been shot by a poisoned arrow, but he refuses to let his friends get a doctor or try to take out the arrow until he has all the information about the person who shot the arrow, even to the point of what kind of bird feather was used on the fletch of the arrow, which is absurd, obviously. But it points, I think, very much to how it's so easy for us to get sucked into that kind of inquiry, trying to get all the information we need in order to answer the question. But what we're ignoring, as this parable shows very clearly, is the task of the only real question is how do I get out? How do I get rid of the? How do I get this arrow out of me? And likewise, the Buddha says the same thing. He says the only thing that I'm teaching is really how do we respond to suffering. It's not a question of what is the nature of reality. And there's the same also in 5th century BC Athens. You also had a lot of early philosophers who were very much concerned with these kinds of questions.
absolutely.
Heraclitus, for example, and others, they were interested in what is the fundamental nature of the world. For
Yes.
Heraclitus, it was fire. For others, it was water. And then
Thales.
you,
Yeah.
sorry?
Thales and Anaximander and all
Yeah,
these.
Thales, Anaximander, all
Yeah.
these people, they were really trying to figure
Yeah.
out what is the nature of this world we live in. None of
Mm,
them were particularly interested at all in what it means to suffer, to be born, to get sick, to grow old, and to die. What's that all about?
mm,
Socrates, as a young man, appears to have likewise been interested in those kinds of questions. He studied with a student of a philosopher called, and I'm going to forget the name now, Anaxagoras, I think, who was one of the leading proto-natural scientists that abounded amongst the sophists in Socrates' day. So Socrates again broke with that whole tradition of trying to pin down the nature of reality, and instead when he engaged people in philosophical discussion, it was exclusively about how do you lead a good life. So many of his questions, if not all of them, have to do with his uh, rather intense testing of people to get to how they understand what is the nature of justice, what is the nature of wisdom, what is the nature of piety, what is the nature of moderation, and so on. The key Buddhist Greek virtues of that time. And he also recognizes that no matter how much he pushes people to answer these kinds of questions, in the end, it kind of, you never quite get to a point where you can say, well, this is justice, this is wisdom. And Socrates repeatedly says that he too does not know what these things are. He says that the
Yes.
only thing that I really know is that I know nothing. And the more that I know, the less I know. So it's not suggesting that one simply abandon these questions, but it's recognizing that by probing and deepening our exploration of these fundamental questions of what it means to lead a good life, uh, is arguably the most important thing a human being can do. And so this leads us to Socrates' famous statement in the Apology, which is the defense speech he gave at his trial, was that an unexamined life is not worth living. And that's a kind of a mantra, if you wish, for Socrates. The purpose of philosophy is to lead an examined life. An examined life constantly attending to how you form your thoughts, how you communicate, how you act in the world, what your values are. It's all very much about ethics in that sense. So I've rather lost the track of what Brian's question was. Can you just repeat the question? Just sum
Just
it up.
about the contrast, Socrates asked questions like, what is knowledge or what is
Mm.
piety?
Mm.
And I feel that he expects a sort of conceptual answer that's non contradictory. He's very
Mm.
interested in consistency. And I'm
That's
not
right.
always
Yeah.
so sure that the Buddha is. The Buddha is much more pragmatist, right? He's kind of, he wants something that works and a process of investigation rather than maybe that's my view. I'd be curious to
Yeah,
know
I think that's
yours.
true. I mean, I think the Buddha is more pragmatic. But the problem at on this particular point is that while we have, I think, a pretty good record of what Socrates said and did in his times in Athens, written down by Plato, who, at least towards the end of end of Socrates' life, was present there. We also have the writings of Xenophon. Xenophon was a
Yes.
student of Socrates, who also wrote his own memoir, his Memorabilia of Socrates. So we get two pictures of Socrates written by people who were actually there at the time, and these texts have come down to us in the form they were originally written. In the case of the Buddha, it's totally different.
Right.
There wasn't any writing at the time of the Buddha. Everything he said was memorized, and this was then passed down through generations. But nothing was actually written down until about 400 years later.
Yes.
And so in other words, what I think happened in that process of 400 years is that the cut and thrust of the actual dialogues and engagements the Buddha had with people get kind of edited away, and you just,
Right.
as you say, you end up with basically rather factual statements of what's good and
Mm.
what's bad and what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and also lots of instructions as to how to actually cultivate these qualities: mindfulness, compassion, wisdom. It's all about something to do.
Yes.
And the Buddha is not particularly interested in pursuing the sorts of questions that Socrates, probes his interlocutors were. What is the nature of this particular virtue or that particular virtue? What the Buddha is more interested in doing is how can we actually lead a life and engage in practices and reflections and disciplines that can actually make us more compassionate, more generous, more intelligent.
Yes.
irrespective of how we actually might define those terms. So, in that sense, yes, the Buddha is more pragmatic, but we also don't have such a vivid sense of who this man was in his actual interactions with others as we do with Socrates. So, there's a sort of imbalance there between the
Yes.
two of them.
And you note that there's a sort of imbalance as well in the fact that within Buddhism, we have a lot of practices that come down, whereas within the Greek tradition, we have a lot of dialogue, but not a
Mhm.
lot of instruction, as it were.
Yeah. Well, that's something that, again, it comes through very clearly in the work of Pierre Hadot, the person who wrote Philosophy as a Way of Life. Hadot maintains that these Stoic and Epicurean philosophers actually had bodies of spiritual exercises that they would formally teach their students, much in the same way as a Buddhist teacher would instruct a student, say, in the practice of mindfulness.
Yes.
Um, and that's a very, compelling idea, but unfortunately, he doesn't provide a lot of evidence for it. In fact,
Right.
virtually no evidence at all. Uh, and I think a lot of Buddhists, when they read Socratic dialogues, or even if you read, the texts, say, of Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or someone from the Stoic tradition, they Buddhists would find it strange that there's a lot of talk about values that they would acknowledge, but hardly any instruction as to how you might, refine and develop and embody these values. It seems to be rather lacking in any practical instruction. Um, so that leaves one with a bit of a quandary, because when you particularly if you read one of the one probably the most interesting philosopher in this regard is Epicurus, who lived about 100 years after the Buddha and Socrates. But Epicurus led a life which is very similar to the monks in India. They lived very simply. They lived in a garden or a park. They were very much committed to the values of friendship and other such things. And Epicurus wrote a huge amount of material, but unfortunately, most of it has not come down to us. We have three letters that are intact, which are well worth reading. They're quite short. But you really get the impression that in Epicurus's own voice, he clearly is speaking from a place that is not one that is riddled with contradiction or with anxiety or with opinions and so on, but it's very much an inquiring, reflective, contemplative way of life. And when there's a famous note that Epicurus wrote on his deathbed, saying that he's in incredible pain with dysentery and some urinal infection, but still finds enormous pleasure in recalling the discussions he's had on philosophy with the person to whom he's writing. So there's something about these philosophers where they've actually really brought their philosophy into the actuality of their existence. But how they did that is a bit of a puzzle. We don't know, actually.
Yes.
Um, and it also raises questions too that I think Buddhists have to confront. I mean, do we have to do all this meditation, for example? I mean, I'm sure all of you, even if you're devout meditators, have probably encountered numerous people over the course of your lives who seem to be wiser, more caring, more loving, more generous than you are. And they may know nothing about Buddhism, nothing about Western philosophy, nothing about Christianity. So where did that come from? Are these innate human qualities? Maybe they are. Um, so those sorts of questions I think are important ones, but this book doesn't answer them. It fleshes out the similarities and the differences between these two men. It also explores the lives of some of their followers, both in Greece and in India and elsewhere. But it leaves that kind of question hanging. How do you, in fact, become a good person, a wise person, a caring person? And I think it's important to leave those things as questions. And I guess here I'm following Socrates. I don't really want to be able to, give exact definitions or provide you with a manual of how to be generous and follow steps 1 to 12 and you'll be generous. I think that's an illusion. I don't
Yes.
think that works. I don't think life works like that at all. So in that sense, maybe that also serves as an example of how these two men are both similar and different. And their
Yes.
traditions likewise have evolved in ways that are both similar and different. But I feel that given the fact that we live in an undeniably global world now, globalized world, in which we encounter Buddhism and Western and Greek and Greek philosophy and other traditions as well. And we're at a state now, I think, where, if we're to tackle the global issues that we face, I think it's important that we sort of put aside the differences of our cultures, our religious beliefs, our philosophical traditions, and try to get back down to the core questions that gave rise to those traditions in the first place. And I think in many cases that really boils down to the fundamental existential question of birth and death. What does it mean to have been born into this world? How do I live in this world? And how can I live a good death? And
Yes.
in that sense, Gautama, Socrates, Jesus, Confucius, Muhammad, they're all on the same page. And it's their answers that differ, and they differ, I think, because of the different contexts, because of different circumstances, perhaps their own personal idiosyncrasies. But I think what really matters is getting back in touch with these core questions of what it means to be human.
Yeah. There's a lot in there. I really enjoyed that. The one of the things that you pointed out with Gautama, that since you were speaking about Epicurus, Epicurus too, I think in Diogenes Laertius, I can't remember if it's in one of the letters or not, basically says that his opinions just go with the dominant opinions. And Gautama says something like, I just agree with whatever wise people
Um,
agree on, basically. And this gets you out of a lot of the problems with views or doxai or
um,
ditthi, right? Where
yes, mm,
holding strong abstract opinions seems to be linked to suffering, both for the
mhm,
Puranists and for the Buddhists. And I thought maybe we could go into that a little bit, because you were saying something about not wanting to settle on any final answer, or give an answer in the book about what it would mean to live a good life. One of the things that struck me is the Puranists, uh, or the skeptics that you discuss. Skepticism, it means something like investigator, right?
that's right.
And there's also this term in the chapter of eights called Muni, which I also
Yeah.
think means
Mm,
investigator. And I've often felt that what's going, in a certain sense, the solution might seem unsatisfying, but it's like the solution is methodological. In other
mm,
words, it is never settling on a final answer. And in that regard, you're right that Socrates and the Buddha have a lot in common, because there's always another sort of question to be asked. There's always another sort of step to the investigation, as it were, as long as you don't settle into, as long as you don't cling to the raft or the ladder in Sextus's
mm,
case. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that as it relates to, yeah, an ethics of uncertainty.
mm. Well, I'm glad you brought the thing up about Pyrrho, the founder of skepticism, because he did, in fact, say something very similar to the Buddha. He said that you know, he feels that we cannot be certain of what our senses and our reason present to us. Their approximations, they're filtered through the senses, through the body. They're tentative. They're uncertain in a way. And so Piro, like the Buddha, says that, we just simply have to accept what is conventionally agreed in our culture and our society as to what would be the appropriate thing to do, the inappropriate thing to do. And that clearly brings him into alignment with that statement you quoted of the Buddha, where the Buddha says that he's not interested in giving you the final answers to these kinds of questions, but if the wise in the world say that something exists, that's good enough for him. If the wise in the world say it doesn't exist, then that's fine too. He's not interested in these basically ontological or empirical questions. He's interested always in how, okay, let's just agree that the world is made in this way. Now, how do I live in it? How do I flourish in that world that I've accepted conventionally. Um, so yeah, those two are, I think, and I think what that also points to is that we might actually maybe need to consider Buddhism as a kind of skepticism too. In other words, and I'm glad you brought up the idea that the Greek word skepsis means inquiry. Unfortunately, many of the words for these Greek philosophical schools have taken on meanings that they didn't have originally. We talk of being stoical, we talk of being cynical, we talk of being an Epicurean, and that usually means you have, fancy dinners and nice wines, which was basically the last thing that Epicurus was interested in. So, in other words, these terms have come down to us and have become sort of distorted en route. But a skeptic in the Pyrrhonian sense is basically somebody who's constantly in a state of puzzlement and inquiry. And although that may not come through so clearly in the case of the Buddha in the Pali texts, you do nonetheless see this very, very clearly in, for example, the philosophy of Nagarjuna, but perhaps even more so in the tradition of Zen Buddhism in East Asia, where the whole of the practice in some of those schools is basically about asking questions and staying with questions and not letting the mind sort of grab onto some clever answer, but to keep on coming back to the core question. When I trained in Korea in the Zen monastery there, we just asked the question, "What is this?"
Yes.
For months on end. And every answer that the mind came up with, you just let it go. And if you thought it was a really good answer, you go to the Zen master, and then he'd say, nonsense, go back and sit. And you just basically clear the mind of all of the opinionatedness that we've picked up along the way of our lives, from our parents, from our newspapers, from our own, personal story or whatever it might be, and try to get back into a state of fundamental uncertainty and
Yes.
questioning, which is arguably the most honest place to be. Because, if I'm really pushed, when someone says, but who are you, Stephen, really? I don't know, really. I mean, I've got all sorts of opinions. I could give a sort of a CV and a job description, perhaps. But when it really, when what's the word? When the rubber hits the road, I have to admit, I don't have a clue who I am, really, or anybody else for that matter, that our lives are founded on all sorts of presuppositions and ideas and opinions, which can be practically necessary and useful, but they're kind of a veneer that actually occludes the uncertainty and the confusion and the sense of wonder and mystery about life
Yes.
that doesn't fit into these convenient kind of codes and theories and opinions that we have. So, in that sense, when I talk of an ethics of uncertainty, which is a very central thread that runs through the whole book, and also, I would argue, one of the most important elements that unites the Buddha with Socrates. It's basically that when we are engaged in an ethical act, in other words, when we are making a decision or choice about something that really matters for us, we have to confront the fact that we actually don't know what to do. We're not actually, we're undecided. And one of the reasons we're undecided is because we can't predict the future. We don't know what will be the consequences if I choose to do A or choose to do B. And yet I can't just do nothing. In other words, we find ourselves as ethical beings who are increasingly conscious of our uncertainties and our lack of knowledge and our lack of information to be able to make, totally reliable ethical judgments. And we begin to realize that ethics is always a practice which involves risk. Risk being a rather more sort of colloquial word for uncertainty. In other
Yes.
words, and what this points to, I think, very much is how that, this practice is basically a practice of being willing to have the courage to take risks, to do things that other than what our habit patterns and our conditioning would have initially suggested. It often means going against the force of conditioning. It means having the willingness to step outside of your comfort zone. And the sort of people who impress me, broadly speaking, not just people in religion, but artists and writers and others too. What really inspires me in learning about these people's lives and witnessing and enjoying their work is the risks they were willing to take to do that work. In other words, they felt within themselves an urgency to write a certain thing or to paint a picture or write a piece of music or go on a meditation retreat or whatever it was that uh, really mattered to them. Uh,
Yes.
Not just a matter of curiosity, but something that really was crucial to their sense of being the kind of person they aspired to be.
Since you brought up inquiry, one of the things that came to mind when you said that there's a sort of link between the Greek inquiry and Zen. There's also the charter of free inquiry, right? The
Mhm.
Kalama Sutta, which
Mhm.
is a kind of invitation in Buddhism
Mhm.
to a kind of experimentation, a trial to see, does this increase suffering or does it reduce suffering? And so that was one of the things that, just as you were
Mhm.
speaking, I was thinking there is
Mhm.
this commitment to, rather than a rules-based system, although that of course does emerge within
Mhm.
Buddhism, there are texts that support this view that you're prescribing of an ethics of uncertainty, which is,
Mhm.
I don't know whether this practice is going to increase or decrease my suffering, and I will know it from its fruit or from its,
Mhm.
from doing it, basically.
That's right. Yeah. No, exactly. The Kalama Sutta is a text which has become very famous in the West. It's a very obscure text in Asia. It's never really been given much attention. What's remarkable about it is the Buddha is addressing a group of people called the Kalamas, we don't know much about them, but and they were saying, we get all of these gurus and teachers coming by. I mean, who do we believe? I mean, why do we accept what one person says rather than another? How can we sort all this out? And the Buddha's answer is basically to give them a list of things that you shouldn't accept something simply because it's part of a sacred tradition. You shouldn't accept something simply because that's what your guru told you. You shouldn't accept something because it seems to be logically completely watertight. And he goes through all of these different criteria that we might quite naturally use to make up our minds. But in the end, he said all that really matters is, as Brian already said, I mean, does this concept, does this value, does this practice, does it actually lead to a greater sense of kindness, of compassion, of love? Does it actually lead to greater insight and understanding? That's they're the only criteria that really matter. The rest is basically revealing more about your attachment to certain traditions and certain views and certain whatever beliefs or whatever. And that needs to somehow be suspended, and you need to sort of get into a space of mind where you can actually live with this uncertainty and not feel that you have to achieve degrees of certainty in order to be able to lead a life in which you will be, fulfilling yourself, in the best possible way.
Mm.
So uncertainty is therefore not something to be gotten rid of. It's not an embarrassment. It's not a weakness. It's actually implicit in the very structure of a world that is highly contingent, transient, and constantly subject to breakdown and failure. That's an uncertain situation, and that's the situation we live in. And
Yes.
so the acceptance of that situation is the foundation, really, for an ethics that could then be built upon it.
I have one final question. I have a very long list of questions, but I'm going to do one more and then open it up to the floor. Um, I wanted to ask you about starting points for philosophy, because Socrates and later Plato and by extension his student
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle believed that philosophy begins with wonder,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Nietzsche and the Buddha both think that suffering is a foundational starting point for philosophy. So I just wondered, if you had any thoughts about what are the dynamics of beginning the inquiry from a place of wonder versus a place of suffering.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. Um, and to me, the answer lies very much in East Asian Buddhism, in Zen particularly, because there you have both. This is a Buddhist tradition, which is very much about coming to terms with the great matter of birth and death, as the Chinese put it. But it's also a tradition which is founded on inquiry, investigation, I would say wonder. In other words, the great matter of birth and death, as they speak of it in China, is precisely that about which you come to wonder, in which you encounter not just the pain of the world, but also the mystery of the world. And in the famous legend where the Prince Siddhartha supposedly leaves his palace and goes out into the countryside and he sees a dead person and he sees an old person, he sees a sick person, and that's what leads to his renunciation. It's usually been, unless it's usually understood as meaning that when he went outside the palace walls, he could suddenly find an answer which would enable him to actually overcome birth, sickness, aging, and death. But I think from a more Chinese point of view, they would see his first sight of sickness, aging, and death not just as a sort of moment of revulsion and understanding that everything comes to an end and everything's going to die. In other words, a rather bleak, almost nihilistic view of life. We find the fact that it's the awakening or the waking up to the fact that you've been born and you're going to die is precisely what renders your life as a question. If I'm going to die, if I'm going to, and I could die at any moment, then what should I do? What should I do? How should I live? So the question, this question of wonder, again, is not so much a wonder is not so much a sort of an ontological wonder, a wonder at the fact that anything exists, although that's certainly part of it. But actually, it's more related to the question of ethics. Well, what do I do? And that's to me just as central. So I think you can find overlaps between a philosophical path beginning with wonder, a philosophical path beginning with suffering. And I feel that, again, one of the strengths perhaps of bringing these two characters together is that you might be able to find a way in which you can integrate the two. That would be my own preference. And I notice that Darius has a question.
Yeah, please, Darius.
Well, it riffs on this last question, and it's a question for both of you because I think both of you would have interesting things to say. You know, in our time, maybe I don't know, since the 19th century, since Nietzsche or someone, some of these questions are framed in the using it's around meaning, right? The meaning of existence, the meaning of life. At the moment, we have people like in Isabella's town in Toronto, John Vervaeke, doing a lot of work around the meaning crisis. And that's not a concept or a word that I think ever appears in either of the two traditions that we're discussing here. For the Buddha, as you pointed out, it was more about the alleviation and mitigation of suffering. For Socrates, it was about ethics, right? How should we live? What is the right way to live? But it wasn't about meaning, and perhaps existence was just taken for granted as inherently meaningful for both of them. I don't know, but I'm curious how that question of meaning you would say relates to these two traditions.
Again, I don't really have an answer, but but what you say is absolutely right. And I was always puzzled by this when I was studying Buddhism with Tibetan lamas and so on. For me as a Westerner, the question, what is the meaning of life, has always been, a very crucial and very immediately intelligible question, and one that provokes a sense of urgency and you know, the need to somehow establish one's priorities in some way in order to really focus on the meaning of life. But you can't even say that in Tibetan. This was the weird thing. In fact, a friend of mine did actually ask a Tibetan Lama once. He said, "Tsedigi dunda karire," which means, what is the meaning of this life? And the Lama said, well, the meaning of this life, it's the period between your birth and your death. Which is true, but it's not the way we use the word meaning. And it rather points, I mean, I'd be very curious actually to see if any scholarly work has been done in the, where's Darius gone? In the Western tradition. I mean, when did this predominance of the question of meaning start? Is it a relatively contemporary, not contemporary, but a relatively modern idea? I don't know. In any case, that may be true, but certainly in the case of the Buddha, we have a clear understanding of what is the aim of life or the purpose of life. And in fact, the Sanskrit and word artha and the Tibetan word dön, which means meaning, both those terms also mean purpose. So the word for meaning is the same as the word for purpose. What is the purpose of my life? What is the goal of my life? And that might be a more useful way to get a handle on this question of meaning. What's my life for? And in fact, when I ask the question, what is this, in meditation now, I often phrase it as, what is this for? In other words, what is the purpose of my sitting here now, both immediately and also, you know, in the rest of my life that is to come? What am I going to do in this world? And so I think if we replace the word meaning with purpose, then I think the Buddha is quite clear as to the purpose. You want to achieve freedom from birth, sickness, aging, and death in the traditional format, or as I would understand it, freedom from compulsive reactivity. That's certainly a purpose of the Buddhist practice. Another purpose would be to become a more generous, kind, warm, loving person in the world. And of course also to you know, to minimize and mitigate suffering as best one can. So that would be the meaning of life. If you could find a way of expressing that in 5th century BC Pali. But purpose would fit. I think in that sense it would. As for Socrates here, I don't really know. I think what comes through very clearly when you read the dialogues of Plato is that Socrates saw himself as someone who had an immense duty to his city. Again, that's something you won't find in Buddhism at all. But it seemed that especially when you read the last, the accounts of the end of the life of Socrates, he really is, I think, trying to sort of articulate what that would be for him. And it's basically to be a citizen who upholds the citizen's duty to their city, to their family, to their children. It means to lead a life in which you are constantly examining yourself. If you say an unexamined life is not worth living, that suggests very strongly that the meaning of life is to lead an examined life. So I think questions of meaning are implicit in a lot of these statements, but it's true that neither man, Buddha or Socrates, actually uses that kind of language. But I think it's there. I think it's buried. Isabella.
Yeah. Go on, Isabella.
Yeah. Well, no, maybe Bryan, if you were going to answer, because Darius also asked, I didn't know if am I?
Oh, that's true. Yes, Darius wanted, this was aimed at the two of us, Bryan. So I think we need your take on this as well.
I think it's a great question. And I think I largely agree with Stephen that something like telos or a goal or a purpose is more the question in the Greek tradition. I don't know when meaning became such a central question within the West. my feeling is that it must be in this sort of early modern period. I would have, if I had to guess, I would say Montaigne, someone like that, that starts to ask these kinds of questions. And certainly by, the 20th century, when you have, well, 21st century, you have a meaning crisis, but you also have logotherapy, which is about meaning in the work of Viktor Frankl. By that point, I think over the course of those 400 or 500 years, it becomes very central that the idea of meaning is somehow the primary question. It is not the question in the 19th century. Even Nietzsche addresses it to a lesser extent. He says something like, the idea of meaningless suffering is new because both to the ancients, where gods were everywhere and in everything, the suffering would have been sort of generated by the gods and for the entertainment of the gods. And in the Christian period, the suffering is related to, soteriology. It's related to salvation, basically, that there is a reason for this suffering. And so it's only after Nietzsche's, identification of the death of God that you start to question, like, well, why do we have to suffer? And we can no longer resort to a kind of pantheistic, notion that suffering means something to other entities that surround us, or it means something in terms of salvation. And so it may, I think, as Stephen was saying, that relate also to that Nietzschean change, basically, that it becomes very central. Would you agree, Stephen?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, as I was just about to say something very similar. I wonder if meaning, the question of meaning and the usage of the word meaning is possibly a post-theistic language. When you gave the example of Montaigne, I'm not sure I'd agree, because Montaigne was, despite his, and I love Montaigne, but he was a very devout Catholic. He didn't have any questions about, for him, God had a plan, and that was revealed through Christ. And Christ's representative on earth, the Pope, is the one who now, as it were, upholds that tradition. And I think, and Montaigne was, he believed quite literally in the doctrines of the Catholic Church. It was very important for him. And yet we have the image of him as a kind of as a humanist, and he was that too. But actually, it's quite clear that he had strong religious beliefs. And in that sense, I don't think the question of meaning would really have arisen for him. What his question is in his essays is really to find out, to examine himself, is to pay close attention to his thoughts and his emotions and his feelings and what's going on, and to somehow, in a Socratic way, really, to dive deep into these questions. And I think what he does is brilliant. But I don't think he does raise the question of meaning, because I think the meaning has already been established by his embeddedness in Roman Catholicism. And then it became quite telling when you were mentioning Nietzsche. Of course, it's after the death of God that we enter what we might call a crisis of meaning. As long as we have God, we don't really need to, worry too much about meaning. That's kind of already been sorted out by the church or whoever. That would be my take on that.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's maybe something in the skeptical doubt that, for me, and the process of self-examination, that starts to sort of foreshadow something about meaning in both Montaigne and Pascal, I would say. Even though they are religious writers, there's starting to be these questions about, well, how do we know, and why is it like this? And,
No,
the
that's
kind
true.
of, yeah.
Yeah.
Isabella, would you like to comment?
Isabella, I'm sorry, we go back to you.
It's okay. My question, however, has changed about 62 times since I put up my hand. So maybe I'll just lay out a few little trinkets in my head and just see how you react to them, rather than trying to make a coherent question out of it. So although there is a coherent question. So I'm starting with where you started, where there is this kind of, you talked about this veneer that seems to be thicker now, and my own experience of sort of investigation at middle age versus my 18-year-old is that it's almost the exact same. And what happened in between was some veneer got laid down. And so the kind of coercive language stories of society and culture and so on actually became overlaid with on top of the fundamental questions of, existential questions, really. And I'm wondering if evolutionarily, or at least culturally evolutionarily, something similar happened. And the reason that we have such a desire now, and why it resonates so much when we think about the Buddha and Socrates and others, ancient thinkers that are pragmatic to some sense about how to live a good life, that's partially why we go to them. It's not because they're old school and they're going to give us, it's that actually we get rid of the shit in between that we've done and all the other stuff, and we get back to the basic questions that they were asking. And so towards that end, I think that part of what the veneer that you're talking about is the nature of that veneer is a whole lot of abstractions over abstractions over abstractions. And now that we have them, internationally in different cultures, weaving and interweaving, there's a real confusion as to how to get through those conceptual structures to find a process by which we see what resonates with us. And language itself feels to me like it's particularly at we could blame it. And so I'm really interested in how people have used language to change the sense of stuckness that we are in suffering, basically, right? I actually do think that most people are going, not most, pretty much suffering is the cause of going to philosophy. Why the hell would we put ourselves through all of that level? If we were happy, it's very hard to understand why we would go to a intellectual study of philosophy, in my academic opinion. But then my question is, I think that what's similar to Socrates and Buddha and people like the Japanese haiku writers, Basho and all of them, is they were using language to try to defamiliarize, to try to crack open the thing that we had. And we were so stuck in language. They were using language in this different way to help us get through and see something beyond language. And I wonder if you agree with that, and also if you also disagree, because I can imagine disagreeing with the way that somebody like Socrates used language. But the suttas and the dialogues, they seem to have something there that's similar that I find really interesting. And I just wanted to
Thank you.
thoughts, basically.
Yeah, no, I appreciate very much what you say, and I also appreciate the fact that you're not, you're expressing also your puzzlement about all of this, and your struggle with all of this. You can feel that very much. Yeah, I don't know really quite how to respond to that. I do. I mean, I do think. Well, it's a language. I think what is probably unarguably the case is both Socrates and the Buddha introduced a new way of speaking about things. They somehow did not just carry on in the same vernacular, the same way of speaking and thinking that had been the case up to that point, but they broke with that. So in other words, they saw the limitations of that veneer or that theorized linguistic superstructure of our lives. And as it were at a point in history where conditions were such that they could actually somehow challenge that, break with it, and introduce another way of speaking, another way of formulating the questions actually as to what a human life should be. And this, of course, is why I think that 2,500 years later, there's probably nobody, certainly in this part of the world, who hasn't heard of the Buddha and hasn't heard of Socrates. The reason they've been remembered is precisely because they were trailblazers and opened up a way of thinking, which, for many respects, I think we take for granted now. And that's the problem, that you can have a breakthrough, a new language appearing, a fresh look at the world, a research, a real flourishing of culture and religion and thinking and art and all these things. And then over time, that quite quickly begins to crystallize into a kind of orthodoxy. This was certainly the problem with the Buddha, is that after his death, and we find, evidence for this right in the discourses themselves, there was a power struggle after his death. And it seems that the faction that won out in the end were the conservative monastic types, usually former Brahmins, who wanted to establish a system, who wanted to have a nice, coherent conceptual framework within which to place the Buddha's teaching. And that then sets you down the road to orthodoxies and institutions and dogmatics and so forth and so on. And then at a certain period, and if we can see this certainly through the history of Buddhism, that becomes a rigidity that is no longer tolerable, and that leads to another breakdown, another breakthrough. And you find, for example, something like Zen Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism or Shin Buddhism suddenly emerging. And I think you can see that similar pattern occurring in the Greek tradition too. And in fact, I think one of the things that this book tries to do is to actually trace, not after having, as it were, had a look at these two key figures themselves, then to look at how their teachings were then as adopted and developed and played out in the centuries that followed. And I think in both cases, and with Socrates, I think you can already see this happening in the work in Plato's collected works. I think scholars broadly agree now that much of what we find in Socrates' mouth, particularly towards the later dialogues of Plato, are really just Plato's own ideas. The theory of forms, for example, is something that seems completely alien to the figure of Socrates. And yet, more and more do you find Socrates mouthing this rather abstract idealistic philosophy of Plato, which doesn't seem to have been his thing at all. And I think that this was recognized quite early on. And I'm sure Plato was fully aware of what he was doing. But once again, you see how a figure like Socrates can be used as a kind of a starting point or a basis on which to build your own theories and philosophies and views and dogmas. And particularly, in contrast to Socrates, who was constantly questioning everything, with Plato, you actually find Socrates beginning to outline a highly detailed philosophy of metaphysics that answers all of these questions. And that completely doesn't sit with the figure of Socrates at all. And so you can see how Plato developed these ideas. Then in the next generation, you have Aristotle, who in a sense leaves Socrates kind of behind, really, and becomes more, and also takes issue with Plato and doesn't develop the theory of forms, but comes up with his own views. And this goes on and on and on. So I think what we're witnessing through both of these figures and their respective traditions is a kind of a process, a kind of historical, cultural, social process in which a great idea enlivens a generation, then it becomes rigid, it becomes fixed, it becomes challenged by new ideas perhaps, or other ways of looking at things. It then breaks down, then you have another resurgence of new ideas. And I feel that we could look at Buddhism historically that way. We could look at Western philosophy much in the same light. And I think it's always useful, if not, unavoidable, that when we look at these traditions, that we do so in seeing them as constantly evolving and changing and adapting ways of living. And that's what matters. And so when Buddhists, a lot of Buddhists as religious people will often hold very, very firmly onto certain doctrines and certain views that they think are essential to Buddhism, and they will not allow themselves to be challenged on that. So you get a lot of dogmatism, you get a lot of a lot of suspicion about anybody who wants to think differently, and so forth and so on. Ryan, Bryan, do you want to say anything to that? Or?
Oh, I just was going to kind of, before we go to Ryan, in a second, just say that I noticed that too in your book, that this, opposition to the binary is and is not that the Buddha has, and the kind of process-based approach as well as, you mentioned Nagarjuna, who represents a return to the kind of, and it's often translated as emptiness, but you go for emptying in a kind of process sense. You mentioned that Sutrism in later Buddhism has a kind of quite categorical, A or B, almost Parmenidean inflexibility, you could say, and that centrism reacts against that. And I guess the final one that I just wanted to mention, which I found really fascinating in your book, is just the fact that you identify 4 tasks rather than 4 truths, which again puts the emphasis on a kind of verb-like process philosophy rather than a fixed dogma philosophy, something like that.
No, I think that last point in particular is actually quite central to my work. I'm actually not inventing these 4 tasks. They're stated quite explicitly at the conclusion of the Buddha's first discourse. The word task is not used, but basically the Buddha's definition of being awake is having recognized, performed and mastered 4 tasks in relation to each fact of life rather than truth of life. And I feel that works very, very well in turning Buddhism from a sort of a truth-based metaphysics, which it often is, the 4 Noble Truths, the 2 Truths and so on, into a task-based ethics. So I feel that I'm recovering the ethical spirit of the early Buddhist teachings. Of course, many traditional Buddhists would disagree. But that to me has been extraordinarily important. Otherwise, the thing wouldn't really be a living tradition anymore. It would be a question of just endlessly preserving and repeating the same doctrines. Ryan, your turn.
Hi. I had a question about, so I have a background in analytical psychology, and I did a little study in Alan Watts' Eastern philosophy. But my question was, so in the West, I think the goal for like Christianity, for example, is like to make, and based on Carl Jung's mental model, is to integrate the unconscious and then become whole, like, or in analytical psychology, it's when you're whole, it's called libido. And in Eastern, I was going down a rabbit hole to try and see if the same thing in the East is the same thing. And when I was looking at it, it was like in the West is to be like one with everything, or like in some Western parts. But I think in the East, it's like to go into the void or something. I didn't know if that was if that was right with my study in Buddhism, but so like I was wondering if that had any overlapping with like each end goal. Like in the West is to be to return back to the source, to the one, like in Pythagoras or whatever. But in the East, it's I remember Alan Watts saying something like entering the void or something. I don't know. I didn't. That's why I went back to Socrates. Was like I know nothing. Like kind of that's where wisdom starts or something. That was my question.
It's very difficult to speak really in terms of East and West, unfortunately. It's very convenient, and to some extent, yeah, there are broad cultural differences. But once you get into the kinds of questions that you have raised, you'll find that the diversity of traditions, both in the West and in the East, is quite significant. I mean, there's lots of different schools going on, and they're all at odds with each other. So that's true of Buddhists. It's certainly true of Western philosophers, and so you don't really have, at least on a sort of a more robust philosophical level, the ability to say in the East they believe in X, in the West they believe in Y. That's not going to hold water, because you'll always find an exception. And as someone who's spent their whole life exploring Eastern philosophy primarily, I'm aware that it's an incredibly rich and diverse tradition with a vast literature, numerous schools, and then you've got every country that Eastern thought has developed, whether it's China, Japan, India, Tibet, whatever. It takes on another configuration again that is reflective, that is being conditioned, say, by the history of Chinese thought or the history of Indian thought. It's all going to develop something different. So I can't really go with you in that sort of general theorizing. I suspect actually that Alan Watts is an interesting character, but it's difficult really nowadays to take him too seriously as an expert on Asian philosophy. He never learned any of the classical languages. He was never formally trained, but he was very much ahead of his time, and he was also a brilliant writer. And I was very, you'll see in this book, one of the very first books I ever bought was a book by Alan Watts. And that was very important to me. And I keep meeting people who still are reading Watts. So obviously he's speaking to something important. But I don't think you can cite him as an authority on, aspects of Asian philosophy, really. By void, that's the old-fashioned word we used to use for emptiness. So, and that even the term emptiness, the Taoists understand it one way, the Buddhists understand it another way, and different Buddhists understand it in all kinds of different ways. It's really not a term that's sufficiently stable to be able to characterize a whole culture or civilization as being somehow centered around it. And I notice that Darius has his hand up again.
I'm happy to let someone else go, but if no one else has a question, I'll jump in. I'm disappointed, Bryan, that you haven't shared some of your strong reservations about Socrates. So maybe I'll channel you for a moment.
Oh, good.
And it's about that tension between experience and conceptual thinking. And Bryan, we were talking about this upcoming conversation a few weeks ago, and he said, Socrates is always pulling people away from their experience. He'll ask people, what is courage? What is the good? And they'll say, well, in my experience, and Socrates will say, I don't care about your experience. What is the real conceptually pure definition that we're looking for? While the Buddha was very strongly interested in experience. All of meditation is becoming aware of the moment by moment experience of whatever it is you're living through. So it does seem to me like there is actually quite a strong contrast between the two on that polarity of abstracted, disembodied thinking and embodied experience.
That's a good point. I think broadly speaking, I agree with you, but we also have passages in Plato which suggest a very different kind of Socrates, the Socrates who could spend hours just totally still, immersed in what we would probably call meditation. There's a famous passage in the Symposium where Alcibiades, who was a student of Socrates, an important military figure at the time, he recounts having witnessed Socrates just standing still and absorbed in thought for hours on end. So you do have a sense that Socrates was engaged in more than just questioning people. What Plato was clearly interested in was the questioning people. But it's also curious when you read Xenophon, you don't get that Socrates. You don't get a Socrates as endlessly questioning people at all. In fact, there's only one passage in Xenophon in which you get a typical sort of Socratic dialogue, which is a very interesting passage. It's in part 4 of the memoir. And I quote it actually towards the end of this book. But so I think Socrates, even on was probably more complex than the figure that is portrayed either by Plato or by Xenophon. And for Xenophon, Socrates was a much more conventional figure. He'd give talks. He wanted to have students. He had all kinds of ideas. But we don't really know much about what, at least from Xenophon's point of view, this looked like. It's all a little bit vague. But I do think it is broadly the case that, another example would be Democritus, who's completely outside the loop of the Athenian philosophical tradition. And Democritus is supposedly, in some sources, Diogenes Laertius, for example, as actually having traveled to India, studied with the gymnosophists, the naked sages, and when he came back to Greece, would lock himself away in a hut and examine his perceptions and so on. And so that's the other passage, although it has nothing to do with Socrates, that suggests that the Greeks were drawn to this kind of more experiential reflection and so on. I think possibly the stories we have about Pyrrho would produce much the same, Epicurus too. But they certainly do not make that distinction between conceptual understanding and experiential understanding that is so clear in Buddhism. Very, very, very clear. I mean, the language, examination, thinking, this can take you so far, but at a certain point, you kind of need to somehow let go of that and allow yourself to simply, as it were, presence, to witness and be with things as they are. But, and I do go into this in some length in my book, but I think there's also problems there as well, because although it seems sort of clear and maybe a bit self-evident that we have our conceptual mind and we have our non-conceptual experience, when you probe it a little bit more deeper, I find it very, very difficult to tease those two parts of experience apart. And I find it very difficult, in fact, to imagine an experience that is so non-conceptual that there's no language for it at all. And if that were the case, you'd have no way really of talking about it or saying anything meaningful about it at all, because it's quite literally beyond words and language,
Well,
as they say.
but Stephen, there's a huge tradition of mystical experience all right across many different traditions, which points to that, right? There are these very powerful experiences, the most powerful experiences some of these people have had in their lives, which are ineffable and beyond description.
Well, yeah, but you can, I mean, I think Wittgenstein mentions this. If you can also push this in another direction, you can see that even if you're not a mystic or Meister Eckhart or whatever, if you sit still in meditation and you just, pay attention to what's going on around you, that also is ineffable and beyond words and mind-blowing, if you like. That non-conceptuality and conceptuality seem to me to be inextricably tied together. And I find it difficult really I'm not happy with that binary. I think it's true on a general level. I get it. And I'm all behind it, in fact, because I think as a culture, we're way too biased towards conceptual understanding. And we have and I think in our social media type worlds, our attention is being increasingly taken away from being here now into jumping onto the next website or liking or disliking something. So I think, that is obviously an important distinction to make. But once you get down to, let's say the core of mystical experience, I find it very hard to really be able to actually separate out conceptual thought, thinking from any kind of human experience. I just can't quite see how that's possible. But again, I might be wrong. And yes, I don't know. Maybe that's a good point to end. I don't know.
Yeah, we are at time. I think do you think that's a good spot to end, Stephen?
Well, I noticed that Ryan had his hand up a minute ago,
Yeah.
so maybe let's give Ryan
Let's
a
get
chance
Ryan.
to come
Yeah,
back.
okay.
I don't know how long of a answer. I don't want to take too much time, but I did a meditation one time, and I think there was a quote from Freud, or I just heard it from my studies, but there was something called the oceanic experience,
Yeah.
which is like a form of meditation. I was gonna see, because like that was again part of the void experience, but I was wondering what your if you could explain that, because I didn't know any other person that knew about that, but
Okay.
yeah.
I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not particularly familiar with Freud. Jung, I know a lot better, but yeah, the oceanic experience that Freud speaks of and others, I think, is usually thought of as something somewhat negative, if I'm correct. I mean, you should maybe look it up. My sense is that Freud saw that as a problem.
No, I was doing it as like it's sort of like a mystical from the meditation I learned from Alan Watts. It was like it's more of like a meditation practice where you convince yourself you're nothing, but like the mystical part about it is like when you realize that then it's like miraculous that you're existing. It's kind of yeah,
Hmm.
I don't know, but um, it's just kind of a philosophy. But my question was, I didn't know if you knew any more description on that or definition on that.
Not really, to be honest. Yeah, I'm really, to be quite honest, I'm not really sure what they are meaning by that. And Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies certainly abound in claims that this person or that person has experienced the void or emptiness, and they've lost all sense of self and all of this kind of stuff. And I can't obviously challenge the people who actually make those claims. I see no reason not to believe them. But the problem again is I've never experienced that myself, and I have no idea what it would be like. It's always been it's a sort of tantalizing carrot that always remains a little bit out of reach. And I just don't find the language of voidness and emptiness and dissolution really terribly helpful anymore. I was very much into that. I translated texts that speak in that language, but I don't know. I think it's all a little bit too abstract for me now. So I don't really use that language. And as Bryan pointed out, I don't like using the word emptiness or the void because that posits something that has a kind of almost, sort of almost some kind of existence in its own right, some reality out there somewhere. But when Nagarjuna speaks of emptiness, he says emptiness is letting go of views. Believers in emptiness, he says, are incurable. In other words, if you hold up emptiness as something you believe in, there is something out there in some mystical dimension called emptiness, and if I meditate hard enough, I'll drop into it. He says such a person has basically already lost the plot. That emptiness is not a thing, even in the most abstract sense, but emptiness is a letting go. It's a dropping away. It's a letting, yeah, it's a letting go of views and opinions. So it's the loss of something. It's not the gaining of some kind of mystical nothingness or something at all. So if we think of emptiness in that way, I've got no problem with it at all. In fact, I think it's a very beautiful way to express these things. But the importance is that we're not talking about some state of mind that you can attain. We're talking about the challenge of living a life which is less determined by your views and opinions,
Yeah,
both when you think to yourself, when you communicate with others.
that's a good point. Yeah, that's what I was wanting to know. Yeah, yeah, cool.
All
Thank you.
right.
Translation that I have from, I think it's in Concept and Reality in early Buddhist thought,
Mhm.
talks about emptiness has been preached by the Buddha as an abandonment of all views, but those for whom emptiness itself is a view, they are said to be incurable.
Yeah,
Which I love
exactly.
that most.
That is, well, that's a sort of a slightly expanded version of Nagarjuna. It was the same idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Hmm.
You turn emptiness basically into a sort of a substitute for God, which happens, It's,
Absolutely. Well, thank you
okay, I
so
think
much,
we're better.
Stephen.
Sorry. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Bryan, and thank all of you who've been here and participating in this conversation. I hope it's been of interest to you.
Yes, it's
And
been amazing. And
more than
where can
anything
people
else,
buy
I
the book?
very much hope you go out and buy the book. So that's
Where's the
the
best place for people to buy the book?
well, in your
Or
local bookshop,
okay, yeah.
order it from a warm body and have
Yes.
and wait for a week or 10 days before it arrives in the bookshop. Keep the bookshop in business, and don't spend your money don't give your money to Mr. Bezos. That would
Thank
be
you so much, Stephen.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. It's a wonderful book, and I hope everyone goes out and buys it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to see you. Hope all
Cheers.
goes well in your lives. And
Thank you.
who knows, we may bump into each other again at some point.
I
Keep
would love
well.
that.
Bye-bye.
Yes.